Good evening. And as Ronald Reagan said when he was made governor of California, well, here we are on the Late Show again. Now that Ronald Reagan is all set to leave the White House, was he ever in it, or was the whole Reagan era an illusion? Certainly Reagan himself sometimes behaved as if he was living in a dream world. He got Brazil mixed up with Bolivia, he claimed that 80% of pollution came from vegetation, and he fell asleep during an audience with the Pope. But, as Ronald Reagan reminded the world in his own inimitable manner, for the first time in man's history, I'm president. Was he just making another movie? If he was he directing it, or was he just acting? One man who was usually there, even if Ronald Reagan wasn't, was Edwin Meese. Edwin Meese has known Ronald Reagan for over 20 years, since Reagan was governor of California. He was crucial to the 1980 campaign that made Reagan president, was one of the men who ran the White House, and until August of this year, he was Attorney General of the United States. He broke the news to Reagan about the discovery of Colonel North's Iran-Contra deal. He was the first person from the White House to reach the president's bedside after he'd been shot. Some British viewers may know Edwin Meese from Spitting Image as the puppet Ed, Ronald Reagan's unquestioning sidekick, but the evidence is before our eyes that he isn't really like that. Christopher Hitchens is the sort of person George Bush really means when he calls someone a liberal. A British author and journalist who wrote for the New Statesman before emigrating to the United States, where he now writes for The Nation and is Washington editor of Harper's, Hitchens finds so much wrong with America that his friends sometimes wonder why he is there, and they've reached the conclusion that a crocodile hunter likes a big pond. Hitchens has said of Ronald Reagan, "How can you tell when he's lying and when he's just making it up? A rule of thumb is that when he's lying, his lips move." Hitchens holds the Reagan administration in low regard, but then so do most people who do not vote Republican. In the United States, however, most people do vote Republican, and avowedly one of them is P.J. O'Rourke, Rolling Stones magazine's self-styled international irrational affairs desk chief and author of the book Republican Party Reptile. He is chiefly famous for an article called How to Drive Fast While Getting Your Wing-Wang Squeezed and Not Spill Your Drink. In the 60s, P.J. O'Rourke might have been the kind of gonzo journalist who thought republicanism was just fascism in shorter boots. In the 80s, he can preach neoconservatism in the pages of Rolling Stone. America has changed, and it seems at least possible to conjecture that Ronald Reagan might have had something to do with changing it. Well, as the man himself would say, the time has come for Ronald Reagan to hang up his guns and buy a little farm. The man who inspired 1,000 jokes about laziness, stupidity, and selective amnesia gave his name to an era and got out of it alive. Did Reagan, the president, know something we didn't? Did he do more than we gave him credit for? How did he get so popular? And is the man we heard about, the real man? Christopher Hitchens, you're unlikely to agree with Edwin Meese about this. Is the man we heard about the real man?
No, I really don't think so. I wrote a column once about Reagan called the President of Laughter and Forgetting, which went down reasonably well with people who didn't like him, but I suddenly noticed went down quite well with people who did. And I thought, what's wrong with this article? And I realized that the laughter and forgetting bit, the cheery amnesia stuff, the likable dotard, was all a collusion with his own image. I mean, the White House was even able to appoint its own criticism. And I thought, no, let's dig a little bit deeper. And I realized that what was really nagging at me was the piece you sweetly quoted from, was the really easy automatic habit of lying that he had, even when the corner wasn't very tight. Terrible lies, like telling the Israeli Foreign Secretary, then Yitzhak Shamir, that he personally, Reagan, had helped liberate Dachau and had photographs taken to commemorate the event, lest it be forgotten. Fantastic lying of that kind. Immoral lying, in fact, insulting lying. Nothing he said from day one of the Iran-Contra affair was anything but deliberately untrue. And this began to worry me because it all seemed to go down so well. And I thought, well, there must be something about him people like. And here's my fair bit. I think it's true people wanted a restored presidency. They'd had two nutcases, Johnson and Nixon. They'd had two near-cretins, Ford and Carter. They really wanted to feel good about the presidency again. They wanted to have something that identified the nation. And they wanted it about the time Reagan put himself forward as a nice guy. And said, look, I want you all to feel great. And I'll do everything in my power, excuse me, Clive, to make you feel good. And though it'll be the realm of illusion, and though it will be financed by MasterCard, and everyone will be better off and no one will have to pay, that'll all be too late by the time I've left. And then you can have your hangover. And we are just about to enter the hangover phase under one president or another.
Well, the question about what he said to Shamir, about whether he liberated a concentration camp, does raise the point about his relationship to the facts, at least, doesn't it?
It's more than a factual mistake, if I may say so. I mean, it's not like saying you were taking the cliffs of Normandy when in fact you were throwing up in a landing craft.
Well,
It's
except that
really a
never happened.
fantastic lie.
Except that never happened. He never said that to Shamir. I was there, and it never happened. And this was a misunderstanding on the part of someone, either the press or Shamir or someone else, but I was there, and he was relating a story about seeing some films, and it had nothing to do with claiming that he had ever liberated Dachau. He never did that.
Well, if
You
I
see,
may
this
say-
is a typical example, I would say, of how conventional wisdom and mythology then is accepted by some who would like to criticize the president as truth, and then he's criticized on that basis. It's just not true.
Well, if I may say so, there you go again. The Israeli cabinet secretary, Dan Modor, confirmed that that's what had been said. Furthermore, 2 weeks later, in a meeting with Simon Wiesenthal, the Nazi hunter, Reagan said it again. So,
No.
it won't do, I'm afraid, Mr. Meese.
No,
Mr.
I
Reagan
think it
made that.
would do.
Mr. Reagan made an Mr. Reagan made an obscenely untrue claim that showed not a willingness to bend the facts or being on bad terms with them. Showed that he is simply blasphemous when it comes to that.
No, you're absolutely wrong, just absolutely wrong. What you're saying
Can you point to a true
happened.
statement he made about the Iran-Contra?
Yes.
Can you say
Well,
one
let's,
true
let's,
thing
let's
he
get to
made?
the Contra affair, because it
Yes.
brings in whole questions of foreign policy we're eventually going to have to treat. We're raising here an elementary question about his relationship to the facts or the past and how his memory works. If he remembers himself as being at Dachau, then he's at least not in control of his own imagination.
That's right, and he doesn't remember himself, and he never said that. Now, as far as the Iran-Contra was concerned, he told, in the news conference, he said some things which later turned out not to be correct. In one case, he made a factual mistake because he had been improperly briefed. In another case, he happened to misstate a matter which he corrected immediately after the news conference when it was brought to his attention. This was a time of great stress, but to the best of my knowledge, and I think I know as much about that situation as anybody,
Yes, I
he
think you
never
do, too.
he never knowingly stated something that he knew to be untrue.
PJ, you're sitting there looking like a wise old elf. Have you got an opinion on this?
No, quite the contrary. As a matter of fact, Reagan, I'd forgotten that whole incident about it, and it remains forgotten. I can't call that up from the.
Only,
Well, it's laughter
only his enemies remember.
No, it's because of the age of laughter and forgetting.
Well, I'm very good at forgetting it. I haven't found Reagan to be an unusually untruthful politician or an unusually untruthful president. I don't think that heads of countries. I think the heads of countries normally sail rather close to the wind on things, and probably for a very good reason. I don't see casting him as as some sort of paragon of liars or something doesn't strike me as right. I think he's been willing to level with the American public to about the extent the American public was willing to listen, which is perhaps not quite as great as it ought to have been. But yes.
What about the image he projects as a family man and just folks?
Well, he's not a family man. I don't think he's ever projected the image of as a family man. I mean, he is I think he is a brave fellow. I think he is a cool fellow. I think that he pays to politics no more attention than they deserve. I mean, I think a man who paid 100% attention to politics, and international, national, or otherwise, would simply be a fool. I think the best way that we can see who Reagan really was, if you look at what happened when he was shot, I think you see the character of the man. It was absolutely extraordinary coolness, and of course you were actually there. I don't know him. I've never met him. I have no personal memories to share with anyone, but I have seen the transcripts of when he was shot, and when he goes into the hospital and the nurse is fussing over him and he says, "Don't tell Nancy about the two of us," and when the surgical team comes in, he says, "I hope you're all Republicans." I mean, this is it showed an amazing coolness under fire, quite literally, and there's something to be said for that.
It means he can't stop being flippant at any time at all.
Well,
Can you?
Good question.
I think that you've put your finger on something that's very important, and which I suspect Mr. Hitchens would disagree with me, but I've known Ronald Reagan for 22 years almost. I've been with him when there was just the two of us. I've been with him in small groups. I've been with him in his home. I've been with him obviously in large groups and in public. The Ronald Reagan that the public sees is the same as the personal Ronald Reagan. This is not a man who says one thing to an audience and then goes off stage and cynically gives another version. This is a person who's very genuine and very honest. And that's why I was somewhat surprised with your characterization of him, Mr. Hitchens, because that's not him. And I think what Mr. O'Rourke has said, and that is how a person acts and responds under stress, and certainly there was no greater time of stress than when he was shot. His instincts at that time were, number one, to reassure the country, and number two, to put people at ease.
On this point about image, it's not unknown for American presidents to have an image to project one. In fact, Theodore Roosevelt did it. It wasn't just FDR. Theodore Roosevelt did it.
Sure.
All American presidents have done it. But the argument has been made, and not just from the radical left, that Reagan is all image, that his skills as an actor, his training in
Let's not
communication.
forget that he wasn't a very good actor. You know, I don't know what all his skills as an actor stuff. I've never seen a Reagan movie. I mean, he's a far better
But he was a
politician
very
than
good
he is
sports
actor.
commentator, and he's very good at ad-libbing, which is the key skill.
Well,
You remember that wonderful film? I think you're in it, in fact, that PBS made called it's called The Conservatives. You play a starring role. There's Goldwater interviewed about the disaster of his '64 campaign, and he said, towards the end of the campaign, they came to me with a speech and said, give this. And I looked at it and I said, I can't give this. And they said, we thought you might say that, Senator, but we found someone who can. Cut. And there's Reagan giving the speech. They found the guy. They found a guy who looked nicer than his ideas or his program, which Goldwater could never do. And they filled him up. They ran him. They took care of his debts.
I think
They
that's
found
part of
him
the-
friends, if need be.
If I may
they
say,
found him
that,
colleagues
the
and
left
cronies.
is forever wanting the world to be as stupid as they are. I mean, they always want there to be some conspiracy that explains everything. Would that life were so very simple. No. I don't.
There's
see
no
that.
conspiracy involved in that. It was just the need to find a candidate more attractive than his program.
By whom?
Well, there was
Who's
no
this?
question that he gave that speech well, but that speech was not a speech that they suddenly put in front of Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan had been saying those same things that he said in 1964 on behalf of the candidate Goldwater. He'd been saying those things to audiences for the preceding 10 years as he went around the country giving talks, which he wrote himself. And I think that the key as to whether this is an image alone, without the substance behind it in the man, has to be the fact that here's a person who started out as the newcomer to the summit conferences of industrialized nations, and when he left at the last summit this year, was clearly the leader of the group and recognized by them and highly respected by his peers as chiefs of state throughout the world. Secondly, I don't think that a person can go into a negotiation, as I've seen him from the days when he was governor, negotiating with the leader of the opposition for welfare reform in California, or as we've seen more recently, his negotiations with Gorbachev, which is not scripted, and where he's sitting down across the table and they're discussing these things and have it come out as it did. You don't do that if there's no substance behind the image.
If this is dumb, give me some more of such dumbness. You know, I mean, it's like Grant's liquor. You know, and perhaps the audience isn't familiar with that.
But it's really interesting that you
Tell
should...
us what Grant's liquor is first.
Sorry.
Oh, it's just that Grant, one of our best general in World War II was World War II.
No,
Oh, now I've got this. It's George Bush.
I like this.
It's a George Bush virus. I vote for the man.
You mean the American Civil War, right?
American Civil War.
Civil War.
You know,
War
anyway,
between the states.
The war between the states. Okay. Yeah.
anyway, he was a drunk, and Lincoln said,
He was known to consume
He actually,
quantities.
it's actually doubtful whether he drank as much as people said. His
That's
image
right.
worked against him. But anyway, go ahead.
yeah, and then Lincoln said, you know, whatever he's
Yeah.
drinking, give it to my other generals. And I take
Because he was successful.
Well, that's
Exactly.
what King George said about General Wolfe. You know, if he's mad, I wish he'd bite some other
some of the
other
exactly.
officers. But
yeah.
I mean, now you want Reagan to bite more politicians, now, and Mr. Meese says, "Hey, great, he made a deal with the Russians." Now, what is it about the right in America now that makes them so keen to wear the medals of their defeats? Reagan got elected partly by saying, and certainly while saying, that anyone who negotiated with the Soviet Union was betraying the West. He
No,
went
no.
on saying that for a very long time.
No,
He
you-
campaigned against SALT II. Only when
Right,
his administration got into
Right.
tremendous difficulty did he suddenly, as Nixon did with China, suddenly fly to the Soviet Union and say, I'm a man of peace.
No,
Now,
you
I
you
think
missed
that's
the
good.
whole point.
It's a
You
much
I think
too
that's
tidy
good too.
arrangement.
No,
I think that's
you
good
have
too.
missed the point. When Ronald Reagan said that he would not negotiate a bad agreement simply for the purpose of getting an agreement, that's what he said before he was elected, and that's what he said after he was elected,
And that's what he did.
he has done. What he did though was to go in and build up America's defenses, to reassume a position of leadership in the world, and then negotiate from a position of strength. I remember in 1981 when we were first in office, and the president, we were talking about the intermediate range nuclear weapons, and the decision was whether we should go ahead with the deployment of those weapons in Europe. And the president said, wouldn't it be much better if we could persuade the Soviets to get rid of their weapons, their intermediate range nuclear weapons, and have a 0-0 balance? And I remember one of our top foreign policy leaders saying, Mr. President, let's talk about something reasonable. We'll never get them to do that. Well, Ronald Reagan did get them to do that by building the strength of the United States, by deploying the weapons and showing ultimately that it was not only in the interest of world peace and the interest of the United States, but also in the Soviet interest to remove those intermediate range nuclear weapons. And as was printed recently in an editorial here in the United Kingdom, he gave us a little more calm atmosphere in the world during the course of his presidency. Now, I think that's a great achievement, and that's not something that's done by image.
That may very well be the end of the process, but isn't it true that you and the other men behind Reagan were the ones who actually persuaded him to take this course towards the treaty? And what Reagan wanted to do was to go into Reykjavik, which he did, with the Star Wars suggestion,
No.
which is that everyone should scrap everything because Star Wars was a defensive weapon and both sides could have it.
No,
Didn't you have to talk him out of that?
No, not that everyone should scrap everything. What he did say was that he would not give up the Strategic Defense Initiative, which is what the Soviets wanted, that he would not give that up. But that what he would say to alleviate that if we were able, and remember this is a research and development program, but that if we were able to have a shield against incoming missiles that was successful, that he would be willing to share that technology with other countries, even adversaries, so that they would not need to fear a first strike capability on our part because of that defensive mechanism. I think the Strategic Defense Initiative, probably more than anything else, is Ronald Reagan's real legacy of the future. The idea that the free world can move away from massive destruction as the only means of trying to deter nuclear war to actually defending against it, a much more moral position.
I'm very much afraid you're right, it is his main legacy. And it's just what you'd expect, a system of mythical astrodome that's supposed to defend you against missiles when they've been launched. The time to defend yourself against a nuclear missile is not
by
when it's,
surrendering
not when
now,
it's,
is that
not
right?
when it's out of the silo
Sorry.
and heading for you at X thousand miles an hour. It's simply an extension of the arms race. It doesn't negate deterrence as it's supposed to do, and it relies upon lasers and devices that, if they work at all, could be used for a first strike. So it's an incredibly destabilizing, frivolous idea.
It's not at all, as a matter of
And
fact.
he opens it by saying, and let the force be with you.
Well, he's
Completely flippant again, and then complains when people call it Star Wars.
Why is it so awful to be flippant? Why?
About nuclear war? Well, I'll be solemn about nuclear war, I don't mind.
Will people be more alive
I'll be
when
a
you
grim
get done
liberal
being
about
serious? You know?
I think what it's very hard for liberals who take themselves very seriously to understand is that Ronald Reagan takes his subject matters very seriously. He takes his duties very seriously. He doesn't take himself seriously. And that's why what you call flippant is to him a means of putting people at ease, a means of letting people know that he is Ronald Reagan and that he understands who they are and he hopes they understand who he is. And that while he's very serious about a subject like nuclear war, he is not trying to pretend that he is something that he's not, just that he's mortal like everyone else. And I think it's an enduring character.
Bill Malden, the American political cartoonist who wrote a wonderful book after World War II called Up Front, he was, of all things, a cartoonist for Stars and Stripes during World War II, and I do have the right war this time. That he loved being at the front, even though it was much dangerous. People were much nicer. The jokes were better. The feeling was more at ease. That the farther away you got from the front, the more self-importance, the more grimness, the more earnest behavior that he ran into, and he simply couldn't stand it and was always headed back up, even though he was a cartoonist and really had no business being up.
Well, Reagan certainly negates that because, and this was said in public, Mr. Meeson, there's no argument about what was said there. Addressing correspondence just before Bitburg, he said, yes, of course I know it was a bad war, though there's no one still alive who remembers it. Though, adding, I was in uniform for 5 years myself.
Well, he was, wasn't
No, he was at the Hal Loach Studios backlot. Where
No, he was in uniform
was
for
even
5
necessary.
years.
Uniform, no.
Actually,
Didn't have
he-
to put on a uniform at the Hal Loach Studios.
Yes, he did. Yes, he did.
he? He
Check
was in
it
the
out.
Air Force
Check it
Reserve.
out.
He was the Air Force
No,
Reserve.
No, he was at the Hal Loach Studios.
No, actually, let's get it straight. Ronald Reagan joined the United States Army Reserve in the 1930s. He was a cavalryman. He entered service at Fort Des Moines, Iowa, because he wanted to be a cavalry officer. He was a cavalry officer. During World War II, as you know, horses were not in great use and deployment. So they used him actually in something that was very useful in terms of his prior employment. He had been in the movies, and so they put him into a training film making unit of the Army Air Corps.
That's what I
and
just said.
That's what he did, and he was in fact in uniform.
Well, it was
Well, if
more
he was in
noble than
uniform,
my
Errol Flynn was in
Vietnam War
uniform.
record, I may say, and much better than his
Well,
Vietnam record.
My Vietnam War record would stand up against yours, I think.
You were
I
on
was
the other
against
side.
it. I was against it.
Well, the question was that this movie background, did it leak over into the way he thought later? Like on the Star Wars initiative, which may be everything you say, but it's also very, very like something called the inertia projector, which the first role that Ronald Reagan ever had in the movies was as a special agent called Brass Bancroft, right? And it was the job of Brass Bancroft to stop the inertia projector falling into the evil hands of the enemy. And the inertia projector could knock an airplane out of the sky at a distance of up to 4 miles. Yeah? And the question is, decades having gone by, whether Reagan is still thinking that way. Because
He is, and it's called a Stinger missile, and it's been very, very effective in Afghanistan.
Okay, PJ, I think, but what you really can say about Reagan vis-a-vis the Soviet Union is whether or not it was Star Wars that brought them to the negotiating table, or whether it was military strength build up that brought them to the negotiating table, or whether it was just because Reagan had been nice about repealing the grain embargo, which I think was probably a very clear signal to the Soviet Union that he was much more flexible on this question of the evil empire than he sounded. Nevertheless, he did it. And a rapprochement with the Soviet Union is proceeding apace, and this has to be put to Reagan's credit, does it not?
Sure. I mean, I've obviously been cast as a sort of lugubrious doomsayer here. And you know, I'm punching air with these guys just as I have been in Washington. You can't land a punch on Ronald Reagan. I knew that before I came on.
You can land a punch.
People say, come on, live a little. You know, be happy. Why not get invited to the party? Everyone else is going. Fact is, the scientist who he consulted with for SDI is Edward Teller, who in opposing Kennedy's test ban treaty said, hilariously, I know I should see the joke, a little radiation is good for you. Yeah. That's the track record of Teller. The fact is he did open up by saying the Russian language contains no word for freedom. The fact is he did say, for a mic test, we're going to start bombing the Soviet Union in 2 minutes. Now, I see how funny all this is. Believe me, I have a sense of humor.
Is he funny? Is Reagan funny?
I'm
I'm already mellowing up, actually. I can see it's been a splendid 8
Edward
years.
Meese thinks Reagan is funny. I've got a suspicion
It's
that Peter
very
O'Rourke thinks
funny.
he's funny.
It's been a
Very
splendid
funny.
8 years.
Well,
I know that for a
he
fact.
is funny. He is funny because he has an ability to say the right thing at the right time to put people at ease, to calm the general atmosphere, and he also has a real ability to tell stories, to tell jokes.
wonderful
Probably
joke teller.
better than almost anyone that I've met. And in politics, there are a lot of funny people,
Yeah.
both intentionally and otherwise. But he is very good at this. But for him, it is a means of relaxing. I can remember one of the most tense situations we ever had in the first year of his governorship. And at that time, we had a real tremendous tragedy, calamity is from a political sense. People were going to have to be leaving the administration and that sort of thing. And as we were leaving, he didn't want the people to leave that room in the tense state that they were, and on the way out, he stopped everybody and told a joke just so that people would go out with a little better feeling about a very serious subject. Now, if that's a fault, then we need more presidents, and we need more leaders like that.
PJ, tell us some of these funny jokes. Give us one example of a
10
hilarious.
most dangerous words in the English language, 10 most frightening words in the English language. I'm from the federal government and I'm here to help. That's not a bad joke.
It's a real fallout. What about, did you see the one he got off the other day about Dukakis, when the Bush campaign had borrowed a false rumor from a neo-Nazi group in Boston about Dukakis having seen a shrink because of his brother's death? And Reagan was asked, and quick as a flash, he quipped, well, I don't want to comment on an invalid. That was terrific. It was one of these, the one-liner
He
always,
apologized.
a one-liner always to
I
have.
must
Didn't he
say that,
apologize about it?
No, he's,
I thought that Reagan's sense of humor was a bit cornball, and from watching him in public appearances, and a friend of mine collected his jokes from the transcripts from the White House, Jim Denton at the Forum Foundation, and he sent me the manuscript, and I was amazed at the quality of the jokes that Reagan had told, many of them in private and semi-private situations. And I wrote a little introduction, to this effect. And I'll give you just one. Old woman comes to the Kremlin, insists on seeing Gorbachev, won't go away, and the guards, are trying to drag her out of there. And Gorbachev hears the noise, and he comes out, and he says, "What's the matter?" And they say, "There's this old woman here, and she won't go away." And he says, "Old grandma, how can I help you? What is the problem?" And she says, "I just want to ask you one question, I'll leave. I just want one question and I'll leave. Was communism invented by politicians or scientists?" And Gorbachev thinks about that for a minute, and he says, well, I believe it was invented by politicians. And she says, I knew it. If it had been scientists, they would have tried it on mice first. It's not a bad joke.
It's not bad.
It's not bad.
It's not terrific, but
It's not great. It's not as good as South Africa stood beside us in every war we've ever fought, for example. That made me laugh. Not as good as South Africa's abolished segregation, same as we have. That made me laugh too.
You're
But
laying
it's
gloves
good.
on. You
It's
can lay gloves
building.
on.
It's building.
You're laying gloves on.
He can do it with some better
land a
material.
punch. He
I
can
think.
land a
You're
punch.
laying gloves on him. You can lay a glove on him about the Libyan raid. I should imagine that was the thing
Really?
that scared us all.
Really?
Haven't
It
heard
scared
much out of the Libyans
it scared
lately,
us.
have
It
we?
scared everyone in the world except maybe in America was scared.
Scare me.
Well, it certainly
Scared the Libyans.
it certainly did have an impact on the Libyans and materially changed the approach to terrorism in which they had been engaged up to that time.
How can you possibly know that?
In that, by the results since that time.
That's like the lumberjack in the Sahara, you know.
No.
What are your qualifications? I was a lumberjack in the Sahara. Well, there aren't any trees in the Sahara. Well, that shows what a good lumberjack I am.
No,
The
no,
Libyans
no.
were
Were
not the source of your trouble before
Yes,
the bombing.
yes,
of
they
Tripoli.
were. Yes, they were. They definitely were. They were
Achille
definitely.
Lauro was not Libya?
They were definitely involved.
TWA wasn't
in,
Libya?
they were
I'll tell you
definitely involved in
what happened.
state-sponsored terrorism. But I think what happened was several things happened. First of all, it had a major impact on Libyan state sponsorship of terrorism. But more than that, it was the catalyst that brought together the foreign ministers of the European community, for example, who within 2 weeks of that event got together
To get
and
serious.
and got serious about terrorism, developed a set of principles. Within a month of that time, I was over here representing the United States for the first time, in which we had been invited by the European community, my counterparts who had the law enforcement responsibility, to sit down and talk about how we could do a better job of cooperating on terrorism. The fact is that terrorist incidents in both the United States and in Europe decreased from that point on. So I think that there was a very big, very important cause for the Libyan response, but more than that, from the standpoint of protecting the innocent citizens of the world from terrorism, a very big result that was important.
And I love this indignation from a country that engaged in some 200 years of giving a whack to little native states.
Oh, wait a
that got
second,
out of-
Hitchens is not a country. In fact, he lives where you live.
Well,
Furthermore,
we're checking on the green card situation just now.
Okay, that's
furthermore, no, look. I
Okay,
mean,
no, finish. No, let PJ finish.
No,
his
I
point.
mean, what do you think, what do you
start
think
his
that the Pax Britannica was based? I mean, it was based in large part on giving a whack to people who got out of line. And they, in fact, I seem to remember in 1776, they tried to give a whack to us, you know, and have been sort of a little teed off ever since that didn't work. And it doesn't always work, but sometimes it does. You know,
See, that's as soon as you mentioned 1776, Ronald Reagan was saying, I remember it well.
and everyone will laugh. and
Everyone will love it.
everyone will think maybe the deficit isn't so bad after all.
Instead of thinking he's got scrambled
Look,
brains. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know where to begin with Libya. You can't prove first that the Libyans were behind any of your woes in
No, but
Beirut.
Gaddafi didn't mind saying that he was rather in favour of terrorist attacks.
Gaddafi, according to last week's papers, is still shipping a ton of stuff to the IRA.
Yeah, this is true. But before the raid, he was...
Gaddafi beforehand was killing mainly Libyans who disagree with him
Mainly?
overseas. Yeah, people in Chad chiefly,
he-
and Libyans who disagree with him overseas. None of that stopped.
And,
He killed-
and
he killed the
Americans
police-
in Europe.
Furthermore,
He
instead
killed a
of,
policewoman right here in
he
London.
did, sure.
And he killed Americans in
you
Europe.
people who should have given him a whack.
But I was on...
But
yeah, I'm just
it's,
trying to
it's
imagine...
just not. I mean, I can't deal with an unfalsifiable claim. They say it all stopped because of what we did. When?
No.
That simply can't be proved. And what stopped anyway?
Well-
The things you were most worried about, the TWA hijacks, say, the Achille Lauro, the other things, they weren't Libya.
We were worried about terrorism wherever it showed its head, and there was no question that Libya was one of the primary nations that was involved in state-sponsored terrorism, and they were much less involved after the response by President Reagan. But as I pointed out, more than that, it also got the rest of the world serious about doing something because it showed that something could be done.
And that was another-
And as a result, we have had much better results over the course of the 3 years since that time.
And that's another thing I want to divide with you, Mr. Meese, if I may. I mean, the Reagan administration was lecturing everyone in Europe about its state-sponsored terrorism list, countries you couldn't do business with. And it took a very high moral tone with any Western European country that tried to have any trade of any kind with Iran, if you recall. And no insult was too great, no accusation of appeasement was too instant for any European country that tried to do that. And for 6 years, there'd been this covert trading of weaponry with Iran.
For 6 years?
I think for 6 years.
No, you're not. You're incorrect.
Well, you should ask Mr. Dewey Claridge of the CIA who testified to that effect.
No, I don't
But he's
think
not
he did.
here. And
He's not
it's,
here, but I can...
And I don't think he
I can-
testified to that,
Yes,
but I
well,
can
he
tell you
testified-
this.
Testified to Congress to that
What
effect.
is-
But if you're referring now to the Iran initiative, This is quite
Well,
a
I'm not
different
referring
thing.
to it as an initiative, if you don't mind, no.
Well, it was. If you're talking in 1986, what was done, this was something quite different. This was an initiative that was presented to the president by his foreign policy and intelligence advisors. There was division within the cabinet on it, but the principal purposes of this was, first of all, the recognition that there was going to be some changes in Iran at some point. When that would be, whether the Ayatollah would die, which hasn't occurred yet, or whether there would be a
seems that it
change in
never will.
administration.
I don't
know. But in any event, that it was important to try to influence events in Iran by developing a means of communication with more moderate elements in the government. Interestingly
By
enough,
giving them arms?
well, let me come to that part.
this is what
because
I find difficult to understand.
Well, this was a part of it, but a very small part. It's interesting to note that as recently as the last month, the New York Times even has said, yes, there are moderate elements, and these are the same people that communications was sought with at that time. Now, the second purpose was to try to use that communication to get an end to the Iran-Iraq war. A third purpose was to try to decrease Iranian participation in world terrorism. And a fourth element of this strategic initiative was to try to obtain assistance from those moderate elements to locate and assist in the return of the hostages that were being held. Now, part of the initiative that was discussed as a show of good faith was that the United States would provide limited quantities of weapons as a show of their good faith, and that the Iranian moderates in turn would try to, as a show of their good faith, try to obtain the release of at least one or more hostages. Now, the purpose of this was so that the Iranians, and this was the plan that was presented to the president at least, that the Iranians needed something to show to their colleagues that this was worthwhile, and they needed certain types of defensive weapons, primarily defensive weapons against tanks and defensive weapons against aircraft. And that's why these particular small quantities of weapons were agreed to.
And the
Now,
president knew that
president-
you were trading the guns for the hostages, among other things.
No. He knew that this was a show of good faith on our part as an aspect of this total initiative.
But he didn't
And
know.
he didn't. And at no time did he know that we were. And at no time did we trade weapons for hostages. What we did was we traded with people other than the hostage takers now, and that's quite different from as it was portrayed.
Well, it's
now,
not-
unfortunately, the original plan was this would happen within 30 to 60 days. Unfortunately, it was dragged out, and more towards the end of 1986, the hostages and the weapons kind of overshadowed everything else. This was not a part of the plan that the president had approved. And then, of course, was the absolute disregard of instructions and unauthorized diversion of funds to the freedom fighters in Nicaragua as well.
And you found out.
I found that out.
And the president didn't know,
and
you told him.
Nobody knew that, other than those people who were involved, and of course, he took
What did you
immediate
say
corrective action.
What did you say to him?
I told him as soon as we had discovered this and we had verified it that in fact people had been doing things that were not part of the Iran initiative, that funds had been diverted to the freedom fighters,
Colonel North had been overzealous.
and done things that just were not proper and were not authorized.
Retired Senator Barry Goldwater said this week that he thought Reagan was a revolutionary president, but on this point about Irangate, he was either lying or he was incompetent. Now,
Well-
that's not a radical left-winger talking. That's
No.
Senator Barry Goldwater.
I'm afraid I have to, as much as I respect Senator Goldwater, and I certainly do, I just have to disagree with him because what he is saying is not in keeping with the facts.
I disagree with Goldwater too, I mean, because it's not a choice. Reagan was both lying and incompetent on that. And I don't see why...
How can a
you
person
should-
be?
I just see why you should presume, Mr. Meese, that we haven't already heard the official story that you just favoured us with.
I don't understand.
Everyone knows
No, it's
that's the line.
That's not the line.
But
That's what happened.
that
I
is-
was
no,
there, and
the
that's what
line.
happened.
Look, the arms went to the Revolutionary Guard, as you well know, has been established. Moderate politicians haven't got a currency of weaponry in which to deal. Reagan came on the television and said they could all have fitted on one truck, the weapons, and they could all fit on a shoulder.
Yeah.
Completely untrue, you'll agree?
No, he said that they
You
could
will
fit on
agree?
one aircraft. He said that they
All
could
right.
fit on one aircraft, and that they were shoulder-mounted.
Shoulder-mounted.
He doesn't know anything
missiles,
about weapons.
and that, frankly, was the impression he had been given by those who had briefed him.
It's never his fault, is it, somehow? I mean, nothing he says is actually down to him.
Well,
It's
one
always...
of the yes, one
I
of the
love this
things.
coming from the left, which believes that nothing is anybody's fault, that any mass murderer has been failed, that the public education system and the welfare system has failed him. That every,
Well, I love
every
your...
One of the things
I
I
love
think
your
that-
softness on crime as a conservative. It comes to that, especially when it's crime in high places or by the rich.
But Ronald Reagan was guilty of no crime. Others were guilty of certainly unauthorized conduct. Whether they were guilty of a crime or not is still up before the justice
Do you think
system.
Colonel North is an American hero?
PJ, is it all right for a presidential party, which the Constitution says you're not supposed to have, to try and fool Congress in order to aid the Contras in Nicaragua?
Let's be very careful now. It's one thing not to tell Congress. That's authorized by law under certain circumstances. To tell them a falsehood would be wrong, and the president never did that knowingly.
Elliot Abrams did it for him and still has the same job.
No,
yes.
he didn't. No, he
Congress
didn't.
now
No,
won't hear from Abrams unless he testifies under oath.
I want to talk about corruption in the Reagan administration, because a lot of Reagan appointees have, one way or another, found themselves under investigation, including yourself. And I think the world has a right to ask: was the Reagan administration corrupt? Was it?
I think the answer is obviously no. I would say you probably had less of that kind of conduct. Obviously, in any government that has hundreds of thousands of people in it, you're going to find some people who are not going to do the right thing. But I think that our administration has an honesty and integrity that will match any administration, and certainly match the Congress of the United States, which is in the hands of the other party. I think what has happened is that political differences and policy differences under some of the laws that have been passed recently are now being turned by political opponents into criminal investigations and criminal matters. And most of the things that have been charged, where allegations have been made, most of which have also been proved to be false, have been cases often where there are differences of opinion, statements to Congress and so on, in which people have differing views, not criminal acts as such. Now, beyond that, I think it's the important thing to note that there have really been very few people convicted of criminal activity during this administration, despite probably a greater array of investigations, most of them politically motivated, than we've ever had.
Yeah, but one of the investigations into you, for example, is coming from the Justice Department.
No. The investigation was originally called for by political opponents in the Congress. The Justice Department handles all these investigations, of course. And that was why this procedurally went through the Justice Department and ended in me being totally vindicated.
I think one
By the
thing's
McKay
important to
report, right?
understand.
Would you feel totally vindicated when all it says
Yes.
is there's insufficient evidence for prosecution?
Well,
I mean, isn't
that was the only
complete
question.
vindication?
That's the only
and where
question
some
that
of
they
those
were asked.
compiling the report say they disagree, they think that finding is too lenient. And you have to be defended by the ACLU.
I wasn't
which you
defended
once
by the ACLU.
They said that they thought the people who said you should be prosecuted were exceeding their brief.
Well,
the organization
well-
you once described as a criminals lobby.
Everybody who commented on that, every law enforcement and legal expert, practically without exception, said that they were wrong on that. So the ACLU just joined the chorus.
Anyway, Mr. Meese isn't...
That's not very gracious of you,
Mr.
given-
Meese isn't on trial here, but the Reagan administration is. PJ, is it an unusually corrupt administration?
I don't think so at all. I think it's very important to understand that the Reagan administration brought real people into its administration, these real people who had actually had a job and stuff and who'd been in business. And I think perhaps there was a little bit of fudging. I wouldn't take quite so sanguine a view, but I think that you got people who were used to sailing a little close to the wind in the business world, especially in a highly regulated economy, which we're becoming by having let too many Democrats into Congress. I think some of these people sailed a bit close to the wind. You have to understand, though, that corruption corruption, I mean, trespassing some government regulations in the interests of making a bit of money is a very different kind of corruption from the power corrupts and all power and absolute power corrupts absolutely sort of corruption that you get from people who are not real humans but professional politicians who really have done nothing but suck at the public tit for their entire life. And I'm much less worried about the kind of corruption that may have cropped up here and there in the Reagan administration than I am about the kind of corruption that drove Lyndon Johnson absolutely crazy and allowed him to plunge our nation into the quagmire of Vietnam, and who made him continually invite me overseas to a place with noxious flora and fauna where people were going to shoot at me, and who managed the death of a number of my friends and so on. That is corruption.
In what your
That
president
is
calls a
scary.
noble cause. Your favorite president refers to that as a noble cause.
Look, they're dead, you know, and I don't want to say like that they're ignobly dead, but the cause was it can be simultaneously noble and foolish. You know?
Fewer people did get dead under Reagan's administration than everyone
Loads.
expected at the start. Loads of people didn't get killed. It turns out after 8 years that the Reagan administration is harder to sum up than we expected when it began. Some people expected it to last 4 minutes before the bomb started
I
flying.
think it was worth
It turned out to be true,
it was worth electing Reagan just to see the Kremlin lights on all night long in 1979 or 1980.
I think that even more than that, I think that the lights were out in the United States because people weren't sitting up worrying anymore, and they had confidence that if you have to say, what is the greatest thing the president did? There are a lot of things. I think the Strategic Defense Initiative, as I mentioned earlier. I think the Intermediate Nuclear Range Weapons Treaty is going to be an important thing. But I think when you really think about it, it is that he restored the confidence of the people of the United States in
There's
the
absolutely
presidency.
no doubt about it. It's hard now to remember what a dark
What?
period that was at the end of the 70s.
10 years ago, people were saying that the presidency was too big for any one man. They're not saying that anymore. Beyond that, he
Ronald
restored...
Reagan has shown that you can do it as a part-time job.
This is absolutely fantastic.
What does this strike you as?
Yeah, this is really fantastic. What people are saying is that, well, apart from that, Reagan's fit with the presidency is not described in the universal way that you say. They're saying that the danger is of an imperial presidency, a presidency that can disregard Congress, disregard the Supreme Court, public opinion, and the press, and can create a state within a state, as Reagan was trying to do before the Iran-Contra
nonsense.
investigation.
Well, that's silliness. And as a matter of fact, I guess it depends on who you talk to, Mr. Hitchens, because the book that I've seen that's coming out is not the Imperial Presidency. The book that's coming out is the Imperial Congress. That's our biggest problem
Well,
we
now
have in
that
the United States right now.
that really is silly, because you had very little trouble with Congress, which was a pussycat.
Oh, no. As a matter of fact,
Try
were
the
it
Tower
not for-
Commission on the state within the state, by the way, anyone who's looking, who doesn't feel reassured by Mr. Meese. On this point, can I say something about the dead people? It's true there weren't very many Americans killed, and it's true that even people like oneself, let's not be pompous, I mean, can bear the suffering of others with great stoicism, but quite a lot of other people were killed, and I would cite the Nicaraguans who were killed from the date after the day that General Galtieri of Argentina was invited in the first month of the Reagan administration to Washington and invited to help train the former Somoza National Guard to overthrow the government of Nicaragua. Now, General Galtieri, I was pleased to see, went down a couple of days ago for making war on his own people. He was an interesting choice, I think, a death squad despot to begin the training of people to kill Nicaraguans. Many thousands of Nicaraguans killed for what now seems to be a completely waste of time operation that the administration is embarrassed to talk about.
Not at all. Nobody's embarrassed to talk
Let's
about
not be
it.
too stoical about the sufferings of others.
It is, however, indicative of Reagan's presidency, I feel, that it's in Central and South America that Reagan can still be painted plausibly as a villain. And then the rest of the world doesn't
Only
agree
by
with it.
those who don't know the facts.
Well, by those who don't agree, by those who may be suffering. But the rest of the world is universally acknowledged after 8 years as Reagan's president that he's a man of some kind of stature. If he didn't do anything, at least there were things he didn't do that were important.
That can be very valuable. at
Very,
times.
very valuable. Gorbachev wanted to introduce glasnost to the Soviet Union, and apparently Reagan hasn't tried to cynically exploit that, but has gone along with it. In fact, they're the greatest double acts since Butch and Sundance, Reagan. And this has got to be put down to his credit. I think Hitch, you may have to face the dreadful possibility. I can remember when Eisenhower's presidency was a joke, when Eisenhower was
sure.
president. But
During
20 years
all that.
later, it looks like a great president. You may have to face the dreadful possibility that Reagan's has been a good presidency.
No, I think it'll be the other way around with Reagan. At the time, everyone thought it was great, but I'm perfectly sure what the verdict of history is going to be.
Well, if it's any
Depends
consolation
if
to
your
you...
Sandinista friends writing history. Of course, if they win, they will be, won't they?
Mr. Meese,
I was just going to say, it's an interesting coincidence that the two presidents in recent times who went out of office with the highest popularity rating in the United States were Eisenhower and President Reagan. Very similar in how the public viewed them, and I guess it indicates. I believe you can't fool all the people all the time, and I think the people have a genuine reason.
Ike was
for
pretty
being
popular
pleased.
around my house.
Which
when I
brings
was
us to
growing up.
George Bush, who's been out there all year breaking his back, trying to prove that he's got what Ronald Reagan's got, and everybody knows that he hasn't. And if Reagan has got something naturally that Bush is trying to get artificially, then Reagan must have something. Maybe he's just nice, and maybe that's the main criticism, is he's just nice.
Not even, I would say, but you're not getting me.
Christopher
I'm not
Hitchens-
going quietly.
Christopher Hitchens, P.J. O'Rourke, and Edward Meese, thank you. And thank you.